The same religion that's capable of hideous acts of destruction can also be capable of moments of healing, of restoration, and of hope.
But educate a girl, and you educate her entire family.
There is a sun within every person.
When that anger sets in, write it. Write the letters, but don't send them. You never want to leave concrete proof of insanity.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this 6th annual Frank K. Kelly Lecture on Humanities' Future. I'm very happy that Frank K. Kelly, a senior vice president and founder of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, is here with us tonight, and this lecture series is named in his honor and for his vision that we should focus attention on humanity's future, if it is to have a good future, or indeed, if it is to have any future at all, given some of the great problems that confront us today. Frank, thank you for your vision. This lecture series was created with the idea that humanity's future deserves our consideration, our active involvement in trying to create a far better future for those who will follow us on this planet. Our lecturer tonight, Jakob von Uexkull, has come to us from his home in London. Jakob von Uexkull is a visionary, and he has the rare talent of being able to convert some of his very important visions into realities. About a little more than 25 years ago, he had the idea that the Nobel Prizes should be given not only in the standard categories that they've been given since the time of Alfred Nobel, plus the economics award that was added around 1971. But that in addition, the Nobel Prizes, as perhaps the world's most prestigious prizes, should be given for considerations that truly affect the human future, including the protection of our environment and issues of environmental sustainability, and also issues of development and poverty alleviation. Jakob von Uexkull even went so far as to tell the Nobel Committee that were they to accept this proposal, he would be active in trying to raise the funds that would allow them to present these prizes without having to divert their own funds from their current prizes. After consideration, the Nobel Committee said no. They weren't going to add to their prizes these prizes that seem to Jakob von Uexkull and perhaps seem to many of us as being so essential for our future. So, rather than letting it go at that, he started a new series of awards called the Right Livelihood Awards, which for the past 25 years or so have been presented in the Swedish Parliament the day before the Nobel Prizes are presented. And they're known as the Alternative Nobel Prizes, and they're given for environmental protection, for poverty alleviation, for work for peace, for human rights, and for whatever the committee of the Right Livelihood Awards believes are actions that will, in fact, have a profound effect on the people that are in whatever part of the planet they're working in will be affected in a positive way and will affect the future of humanity. Most recently, Mr. von Uexkull has had another idea, and that idea is that there needs to be a council that will be a voice for the future. You know, those who will follow us on this planet aren't here to stand up for their own rights. And if in the governments and parliaments of the world there is no voice for future generations, then we do a huge disservice to them by using up resources, by polluting the planet, by setting precedents of human rights abuses, and so forth. So we really need the kind of institution that Jakob von Uexkull is now proposing, a World Future Council that will bring together wise elders and innovators and youth in a council that will concern itself only with what needs to be done to preserve humanity's future, and will be that very voice of those who are not yet here. The first meeting of the World Future Council will take place in May in Hamburg, Germany, and I hope all of you will be hearing a lot about that after this meeting takes place. I hope there'll be sufficient publicity that people all over the world will hear the voice that comes from this council. The lecture tonight is entitled Globalization, Values, Responsibility, and Global Justice. After the lecture is complete, Jakob von Uexkull will take questions from the audience, so please save your questions and we'll have a period of time for them at the end of the lecture. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Jakob von Uexkull.
Good evening. I want to start with two quotes, which are both 69 years old, but again very relevant. The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients is coming to a close. We are now entering an era of consequences. Sir Winston Churchill, 1938. The liberty of democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in essence, is fascism. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1938. We live in historically unique times. Never before have the consequences of our decisions been so deep, so far-reaching, both in time and in space. We cannot globalize rights without globalizing duties and responsibilities unless we want to globalize barbarism. Our responsibilities grow with our power, and today we have unprecedented power to change the whole world for better or for worse. We have the duty to create a fair and a future-proof world because we have the means to do so. But what are we actually doing? John Kenneth Galbraith described globalization as just the latest word for the continued pursuit of US global interests abroad. Professor Joseph Stiglitz, chair of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors, describes US global strategy as, quote, based on putting aside principles of social justice, equity, and fairness in order to get the best bargain for American special interests. And the US economist and recipient of the Right Livelihood Award, Professor Herman Daly, calls globalization a last attempt to escape natural limits to economic growth by growing into the economic and ecological space of other countries. And the Financial Times concluded recently that globalization has been imposed by economic elites on a mostly unwilling public. And one more critic, Professor David Korten, a long background in Harvard Business School and then as president of the Ford Foundation in Asia, describing his experiences. He says, "It has not been easy to create a world order in which roughly $50 billionaires own as much as the poorest 1/2 of the world's population. It's taken long and dedicated efforts by a greedy elite and their helpers in politics, the media, the law, etc., to create such a world order. And it's going to take equally dedicated efforts from all of us in civil society to create a fair and sustainable global order." I quoted mainly economists because, firstly, the economic sector increasingly rules all others. The US sociologist Benjamin Barber has said that it's very strange that when the church controls all sectors of life, we call it unfree and theocratic. And when a one-party state controls all sectors of society, we say that this is totalitarian and unfree. But when the economic sector controls all other sectors of life, we celebrate it as the pinnacle of democracy and freedom. All globalization is ultimately economic. It's often said that this is just one aspect of it. You know, you have cultural globalization, you have the media. Of course we do, but under present conditions, they are all determined by the interests of economically powerful elites. And that is, of course, one reason for the growing opposition to globalization in so many countries, is the unevenness of the distribution of the benefits. Even Stephen Roach, the chief economist of Morgan Stanley, admitted recently, quote, "It's not a win-win situation." Of course, we have Thai restaurants in cities like Santa Barbara, but we don't have Thai banks. We don't have Thai boarding schools teaching our children. But that's what the Thais have. They have foreign banks, and they have now English boarding schools teaching their elites in English so that they can't even speak the language of the country they are going to rule in future. And of course, as a result of that, it's not Thai values which are spreading here like our values are spreading in Thailand. On the contrary, the Right Livelihood Award recipient Sulek Sivaraksa reports that in the 1950s there was actually a mission from the CIA in Thailand investigating how Thailand could be turned into a consumer society, and they concluded that the main obstacle were the Buddhist values of sufficiency, and somehow one would have to sort of stop teaching those if one was ever going to make the Thais into consumers. And that's in fact what's happened. When I was there recently, they told me that these values are only taught now in primary school, but no longer in secondary school and in universities. The defenders of this globalization model, because of course one could imagine many others, claim that A, it has democratic legitimacy. Tony Blair says it is the result of choices of individuals, and B, that it is irreversible. So they say we have chosen it, but we can't undo it. But of course, if you don't allow democratic alternatives, you open the door to undemocratic ones. If you don't allow rational ones, you let in the irrational ones. Or to quote the assassinated Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, "Desperate people do desperate things." Globalization today has failed even on its own terms. Economic growth, which is its measure of success, was greater in basically all areas of the world in the 1960s and 70s, in the decades before globalization, than it has been in the decades since. So to the frequent rejoinder which you often get as a globalization skeptic or critic, you don't want to go back to the 70s, do you? One could answer, why not? And the 70s, of course, was also a decade of US global environmental leadership, which I think many people in the world would long to see restored. Now, secondly, the economic growth which we still do have is not improving the quality of life in the industrialized world anymore, as has been promised, causing the Financial Times to headline a report by a British economist about happiness indicators. The hippies were right all along. In the United States, consumption grew by 45% between the 1970s and the 1990s, but the proportion of the population describing themselves as, quote, very happy, actually fell, while depression, obesity, eating disorders, crime, family breakdowns, and inequality all increased. In the UK, the people grew richer under Thatcherism, but all key quality of life indicators fell. Elsewhere, those who are supposed to long to adapt to this model respond very differently when actually asked. There's a survey of women in the United Arab Emirates presented at the conference on globalization for the common good in Dubai, found that 85% responded with angry, sad, scared, and or frustrated when asked how they felt, quote, when you think about Western influence in the future, while only 15% felt happy or optimistic about it. Asked about Western influence in general, 52% of women in the UAE saw it as negative and only 6% as positive. Looking at the declarations of representative large international youth conferences over the past decade, you'll find the same deep skepticism and rejection of the current US-inspired globalization model. Why? Because despite its superficial attractions, it is increasingly felt to be a declaration of war on all other cultures, commodifying all relationships, dreams, and desires. The citizen is disconnected and shrunk into the consumer, expected to find fulfillment through shopping. The culture of consumerism fosters permanent dissatisfaction, envy, and discontent, beginning with preschool children, thus shortening their childhoods. At the same time, the older generation is no longer honored as holders of wisdom, but pressured to stay young by consuming. All generations are compressed into immature, easily impressionable, developmentally delayed young adults. In this culture, the answer to any crisis is to shop more. After 9/11, President Bush's mother asked her son what she could do to support America. He replied, and I'm not making this up, "Mom, if you really want to help, buy, buy, buy." But economic totalitarianism, to use Benjamin Barber's expression, not only fails to satisfy us, it is literally costing us the earth. The British financier Sir James Goldsmith said, looking around in this world where I have made my billions, I feel as if I won a round of poker on the Titanic. And the former World Bank chief economist Sir Nicholas Stern, in his recent report on climate change, calls this the greatest and widest-ranging market failure ever. The large corporations, the so-called global players, promised in Rio at the Environment Conference in 1992 that they, being already globally organized, would also take care of the environment, would help solve this problem. And of course, one can note the complete failure situation today is almost unimaginable if you look back 15, 20 years ago. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, I served on the board of Greenpeace in Germany, and I was also a member of the European Parliament for the Green Party. And I don't remember even the more sort of extreme or so-called fundamentalist Greens projecting or foreseeing that things would be as bad today. And if people bring up the Club of Rome report about limits to growth. It is of course true that oil is probably going to run out a few decades later than was originally projected. But that is really of little consequence in the whole order of things. In other areas, the Club of Rome underestimated the destruction of the environment. The erosion of arable soil, for example, has progressed much faster than they expected. But the destabilization of climate is, of course, such an unimaginable and overriding threat because it threatens everything. You can now go to Davos, the World Economic Forum, and you get presentations on climate chaos which are as shocking as anything which Greenpeace would tell you. And one Indian businessman coming out of such a presentation said to me last year, "What's the use of all my family's business and philanthropic work in India if the monsoon rains stop coming?" Climate chaos is much more than just an environmental issue. It is the greatest threat imaginable to the security and freedom of our children and future generations. Causing climate chaos is intergenerational terrorism and genocide. It is, to quote the British writer George Monbiot, the greatest crisis humanity has ever encountered, an awesome, scarcely conceivable responsibility. Mark Lynas, who has documented the increasing speed of some of the changes occurring, calls it a threat so large as almost to defy comprehension. Just two examples. The melting of large glaciers, some of which provide drinking water for hundreds of millions of people, is accelerating much faster than predicted even a few years ago. At the European Geosciences Conference in 2005, it was announced that the giant columns of ice growing down into the ocean from the so-called Odden ice shelf off Greenland, which set in motion the Gulf Stream current, vital for the mild climate in large parts of Europe, that these columns had almost completely disappeared within the last 7 years. As a result, the Cambridge University scientist who headed the research team involved warned that the film The Day After Tomorrow could become reality in the UK and other parts of Europe within a few years. The UK government's chief scientist spoke of his fears of a sudden catastrophe until he was told off for upsetting the US administration. One of the first to notice the hollowness of the current system and its promises is the man who brings the global players together every year, Professor Klaus Schwab, the founder of the Davos World Economic Forum. When I received the latest book a few years ago of this David Korten, who I mentioned before, with its sort of very profound critique of the present global economic order, and with a subtitle, well, it's called The Post-Corporate World, subtitle Life After Capitalism. And on the back cover you find the endorsement, A Hopeful Signpost for the Future, Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum. So I said to David Korten, I mean, how comes that the man who's organizing the greatest gatherings every year of global capitalists, and he gets your book subtitled Life After Capitalism, and he calls it A Hopeful Signpost for the Future? And Korten said, well, yes, I was rather surprised too, but Professor Schwab came to visit me. And he said, Professor Korten, you're right. So Korten said, well, why don't you invite me to Davos then? And Schwab replied, the world is not ready for that yet. So why is it so difficult to change the system? Why are we still not ready? The instinctive answer of the critics is that there's a small, greedy group at the top running the show, and while this is not, of course, the whole answer, it is an important part. Bernard Lietaer, who taught in Belgium, who taught in a university in Colorado until recently, while he was here, did some very thorough research into how this current system, how this political shift happened here over the past 20, 30 years. And he found that there was a small group of US billionaires who seemed to have spent like $1 billion to actually fund this transition to neoliberal globalization by funding over a long period of time think tank, careers, journalists, media outlets, politicians. He found that there were actually 43 such right-wing think tanks which meet, or at least met when he did the research last year, still every Wednesday in Washington to decide how to influence the media of the week. And it didn't surprise me greatly, because there was a study in the UK some years earlier which found that Thatcherization was actually funded by three UK institutions who funded the Thatcher's takeover of the Conservative Party, the development of the policies, and the media propaganda which helped to implement them, as under the heading of TINA, as you know, Mrs. Thatcher's nickname, there is no alternative. And the study found that one of these three institutions was funded entirely by one chicken farmer. So 1/3 of Thatcherization we can thank one chicken farmer for. I think the problem today is that we are still talking about the business sector as if it was one sector, which of course it is not. I mean, I've spoken to, especially to associations in Europe of small and medium-sized businesses who feel as threatened by the planned economies of these so-called global players as any consumer would do. And you find today that the problem is that there are a whole number of very forward-looking entrepreneurs, because, I mean, clearly to anybody with any sense, I mean, what we're now facing, the massive reconstruction of our whole industrial economy, is the largest, the biggest entrepreneurial opportunity ever. But unfortunately, those who have most of the resources at the moment are, of course, those who are profiting from the present system, and I call them the horse traders and the buggy producers of today, because you can imagine how the horse traders and the buggy producers reacted when the motor car was invented. I'm sure they would have liked to stop the whole process, but they didn't have as much power as those who today are trying to stop the progress to a sustainable and just global order. Many of these people, of course, are stuck in an ideological prison. They remind me very much of the Soviet bureaucrats I met in Moscow in 1989, who would tell you that no, I never said I was a communist. I just said I'm a member of the Communist Party. So, still holding on to, in this case, what I call the Economist Party, while really not believing it anymore, but not daring to step outside. It's interesting how the dividing lines go between those who dare to step outside and those who are still imprisoned, because it goes right through the elites, right through the economic elites. I mean, on one hand, you have Lawrence Summers, chief World Bank economist, economic supremo under Clinton, not under Bush, president of Harvard, who actually believes that the environment, our natural environment on which we all depend, is a dependent subsystem of our economic system. Now, this is a fact. He was at the World Bank at the same time as Professor Herman Daly, I already mentioned, and Summers came with a book manuscript where there was a diagram showing exactly that. Box within a box, the environment as a box within the economy. And Daly, of course, pointed out to Summers that it's actually the other way around. And Summers refused to believe him, and finally, because Daly had to approve the book, it appeared without the diagram. Now, I would suggest to you that the belief that our natural environment is a subsystem of our human economy is about on par with the belief that the world is flat. And I would suggest to you that it is pretty scary that, we have somebody, and he's not the only one, in such positions of power in different areas who actually really believes that. And then, of course, you have on the other side, you have, Joseph Stiglitz, who has realized what's been going on. He pointed out in a lecture I heard recently, said that, of course, different values leads to different kinds of globalization. If we had globalized labor instead of globalized capital, we would, of course, live in a very different world. He also dismissed those who argue that the problem is imperfect globalization by pointing out that if globalization was actually perfect, then the salaries of unskilled labor in the USA and in Western Europe would be the same as the salaries for unskilled labor in China and Uzbekistan. So he said to his people, told his critics they should be very grateful that globalization is in fact still imperfect. Otherwise, we probably have civil war by now. There are, of course, limits even to the critics' thinking. There seem to be certain taboos. The clearest one has to do with money creation. Very few people dare to touch and look at this issue. It's regarded as a realm of cranks. But it's, of course, absolutely the key issue in the world today. Because the answer you always get to any question, any proposal in the end is, well, who is going to pay for it? And there are very few today who have the courage of the late Senator Robert Kennedy, who, when he was proposing his version of health insurance to an audience of young medical students, and one of them sort of called out and said, well, who's going to pay for it? And he turned to them and said, you are, because you are the privileged ones in society. Of course, as John Maynard Keynes, the great British economist, said, whatever we as a society can do, we can also fund, we can also finance. So money is not the problem, but clearly we need to change the rules. And as I said, few have bothered to learn and understand this. But it is absolutely important that we do, because in a world ruled by money, those who set the rules of money creation are the ones who actually rule. George Soros has written about this, so has Joseph Stiglitz. They understand it, but they don't really go far enough, because Soros says, well, it's pointless. The US Congress would block even any small reforms of the IMF rights, the rules for money creation, they're called special drawing rights. Stiglitz says, well, this is necessary, but the IMF would not be the right institution to do it, and he doesn't know which one could. But it's quite clear that this is an area which we have to face. There are studies which have shown that, for example, with the funds spent on the first Gulf War, this is a study which came out in the 90s after that war, you could have provided safe drinking water for everybody on Earth. And at the time, the governments participating, I remember this in Britain, where I live, declared that they were going to participate in this war, whatever the state of their economy, whatever the cost was. And it's strange that we have not had any government, any finance minister in a rich country coming out with a similar declaration in favor of the right of everybody to clean water. Then suddenly it is a question of money. I give two examples of how this debate has become sort of stuck in a very strange way, how the ruling ideology sort of imprisons us. There was a debate a few years ago with Nobel Prize laureates in economics, and I asked them why, when I got a chance to ask a question, why they could not deal with the fact that the Japanese were not consuming so much anymore. People on the planet think that they are rich enough and they start saving more and consuming less. Now, why are we not celebrating this in a world of finite resources instead of castigating them and trying desperately to get them to start consuming again? And the head of the Nobel Foundation came to me and said, but when we had zero growth in Sweden, we had 15% unemployment. And so the sociologists will tell you that when you get up to 15, 20% unemployment, you risk social breakdown and civil war. But surely this is a problem, that we have created a system which is so mad that the choice is either between zero growth, stop the economic growth, and then you soon have social collapse, or you have continued economic growth until you have an environmental collapse, which of course will also lead to a social collapse. Now, surely there should be some way, with all these brilliant thinkers we have, to match the fact that we have all these unmet needs. We have gigantic needs for programs, for example, to introduce renewable energy, public transport systems. These are jobs for which you can train people in months. You don't need years of academic qualifications. And we have about 1 billion people on the earth who are either unemployed or underemployed. Surely there should be some way of matching these two together. Another experience was a Swiss writer who had written a book about the peak oil scenario, which is, there's a lot of evidence for the fact that we are heading very rapidly towards the point in time when our global oil resources will have reached their peak, and afterwards they will decrease and prices will obviously explode. And this has been denied for a long time, as if you can have infinite oil resources in a finite planet. Now, when he assembled all this evidence, Swiss financiers got pretty worried about this, and they asked him to bring all these experts together, and they did a presentation. And afterwards, the Swiss banker said to him, but If you are right, we haven't got a clue what to do, because 80% of the values of all our funds in which we invest, for all the pension funds, etc., are based on the expectations of future profits. And clearly, if you are right, many of these companies are going to become worthless. But what do? We can't, we have to invest somewhere. Even the insurance companies say, yes, we are faced with greater catastrophes, more and more of them every year. But how do they get the money to pay for these damages from their investments in the old economy? So clearly we need new rules. We need sort of a transition here on the international level, on the national level. And so far there has been, I think, a fear of thinking along those lines. The thinking is still inside the box. It reminds me increasingly, when I see this going on, of what the Soviet Union was like in the years before it broke down. So to summarize, globalization at present is a world order based on $1, one vote. Environmentally, it's destroying the natural base on which it depends. Socially, it is destroying our sense of community and justice, on which functioning markets ultimately also depend. And politically, it's undermining the legitimacy of governments, without which markets ultimately also cannot function. From a security aspect, it's building a world of increasing conflicts over ever scarcer resources, and of course the coming conflicts over water is probably going to be the most serious one, because if you have no oil, there are other energy sources, but there is no alternative to water, as we know. And some studies show that already by the year 2020, 40% of the world's population will not have enough water to grow their food. It really is in our attitude to future generations that our irresponsibility is most shocking. Contrary to the claims of the postmodern value relativists, there are common human values, of which the foremost is probably our deeply felt obligation, I would call it a birth instinct, to hand over a better, or at least not a worse, world to our children and future generations. All previous generations on this planet lived according to that value, because if they hadn't, we wouldn't be here, but extinct long ago. So how have we ended up in this mess? I think it's instinctive to look at some of the discussions of those who had advocated the nuclear exchange, first use, etc., during the Cold War. What happened after the end of it? There was one close advisor to Margaret Thatcher, Sir Peregrine Worsthorne, who wrote afterwards that quite horrified about the fact that, if there had been some dispute with the Soviet Union when it was really breaking down internally in the 1980s, he would have advised Margaret Thatcher, and she would probably have advised Reagan to actually start a nuclear war. And he wrote, how would future generations have looked back upon us? They would have been guilty of crimes worse than those of Hitler and Mao and Stalin combined. And he finishes his article with the sentence, how could I ever have believed anything so preposterous? And I think that is the same today. If we don't change course quickly, we are only going to face the question of whether our grandchildren are going to look back on us as having been criminals or having been mad. Can we change? Of course we can. Al Gore compares the climate threat with the challenge of fascism. It is in some ways even bigger than that, but it's interesting and instructive to remember that when first Britain and later the US decided to stand up to the challenge of fascism, in Britain private car use was reduced by 95% within a few months. In the US, over 1,000 factories were converted from civilian to military use, again within a couple of months. And of course, there are many examples of how fast change happens when the time is ripe. It is not the question anymore of decades. It sometimes may not be even years, it may be months, and we need to be ready for that, and we need to make sure that we are part of the solution and not part of the problem, every one of us, every day. I remember when I was in Moscow again in May 1989, and I heard at some international conference, and I heard the head of the West German government delegation assuring his East German colleague, don't you worry, nobody in the West is thinking about changing the status of Berlin. And the wall fell 6 months later. None of them were prepared for it. Clearly what we now need is massive. We need a political, policy, an economic, a legal, and an institutional framework for the rapid reconstruction of our energy production systems, our industrial base and the way of life, and our way of life, in order to halt and reverse developments like climate chaos as soon as possible. But it can be done. It doesn't mean abolishing civilization, as some claim. It requires eminently doable reforms, which pale into insignificance compared to the consequences of further delays. It requires, for example, progressively tightening vehicle fuel efficiency standards, a speeded up renewal of our building stock using optimal energy-saving technologies, a massive construction program of mass transport systems and fast train services in order to reuse car and air traffic wherever feasible. These are the kind of measures we need. These are the kind of measures which will also provide millions of new jobs. The one legislation in Germany promoting the spread of renewable energies alone has, over the past 5 years to 8 years probably, generated, the estimates vary a bit, between 170,000 and 300,000 jobs in one country alone. This legislation has now spread to about 40 countries. So to claim that these reforms are not affordable means that the richest generations ever are saying that they can't afford to live on this planet. The challenge is not economic, it's moral and ethical. The most serious crisis is not one of these crises I mentioned out there, it's our lack of vision and courage to act. It's not a question of leaving it to the market. Markets are servants, not masters, responding to the ethical, political, and legal framework within which they operate. For the real entrepreneur, the challenge I have described is, as I said, the greatest opportunity imaginable. What's being demanded is no doubt difficult, but the alternative of business as usual is clearly impossible if we project its fantasies just a few decades into the future. Why are things now beginning to change quite rapidly, even within a few months? I mean, who would have thought that Henry Kissinger would come out against nuclear weapons? Who would have thought the kind of statements find in major financial economic papers about climate change? Unimaginable even 6 months ago. Because the elites who have known for quite some time and admitted privately that they are no longer in control are now finally losing their arrogant belief that somehow they could decide, who has the right to the bomb, that somehow technological progress and market rules would solve climate chaos. So there is a huge opportunity. Of course, there's no guarantee that we will succeed. We may, of course, fail. That's the price of human freedom. The great German philosopher of hope, Ernst Bloch, wrote that the price of human freedom is that the great historical moment may encounter too small a human race, which is not up to the challenge. But clearly, there is no reason why we shouldn't do our best. It's not too late. It is, of course, not possible to ignore the fact that we wasted 20 or 30 years. The kind of sustainable world we could have built if we had changed course 30, 20 or even 10 years ago is not what we're going to get today. But there's still a lot to play for. There are map projections, for example, of the United States, how it would look like if the climate optimists are right and if the pessimists were right. So if those who say that if we do our best now, then you look at the map of Florida. I haven't seen one of this coast. I'm sure it would also look different, but the coastline of Florida is pretty much changed. But it's still quite a difference, because if the climate pessimists are right, if we continue with business as usual for a few decades longer, and you then look at the map later this century, there's no Florida left. And if you imagine if Florida is gone, you imagine what will have happened to a lot of low-lying countries, island nations, etc. in the world. So, we do have this unique opportunity, but unfortunately, it is not really being responded to yet. Civil society seems timid, in some ways almost paralyzed. The demands of environmental organizations is now on climate change is less than the science demands. The major environmental organizations are basing their demands on calculations which are considerably lower than that which is now scientifically necessary, because they don't think that the people, even their own members, will accept that. I think that is very foolish. But I had a situation recently at an international conference on democracy where government representatives came to me, and actually not the US and UK governments, but these were people from the global south, and complained that the NGOs, civil society demands at this conference were so timid that they were extremely disappointed, because they had hoped they could always argue that there were civil society was more radical than they were, and they could then use these demands from civil society when they were negotiating with the rich countries, with industrialized countries. But they now found that they were, in fact, the southern governments were more radical in their demands for democracy, for stronger environmental rules, etc., than the NGOs were. I think that there are two, maybe more, but at least two major reasons for civil society's failure in the West so far to capture this unique opportunity. One is what I've called the denigration of politics. In ancient Greece, the person who involved themselves in the political life was known as the politis, and the one who refused to get involved was known as the idiotus. But today, we have a situation where civil society organizations are taking pains to distance themselves from politics wherever they can instead of engaging in it. Even the name NGO, non-governmental organization, is symptomatic of that. And I believe we need to make the walls between society and politics much more permeable, much more transparent. We need to stop leaving politics to politicians. Setting up a political party, especially on the local or regional level, is quite often the most effective way to affect change. There's nothing wrong with setting up one-issue parties, even on a short-term basis. To understand what power is and how politics works, you've got to engage in it. I served one term as a member of the European Parliament, and I once set up a one-issue political party in my native Sweden, and the experiences were invaluable, I must say, for my other work. If you disdain politics and think outside pressure is enough, then you're likely to fail, I suggest. The second challenge is to overcome the short-term thinking and value relativity, which is so dear to many progressives, especially also in this country. Those in power may talk of competition, but they are very good at cooperating. They fund long-term, they support their own, they fund institutions, they fund careers, they fund their political allies. Progressives prefer to fund problems and victims, rarely sticking with an issue for long. There's much competition and much not invented here syndromes. As one critic said, mergers between NGOs are few and far between. I would recommend the book Moral Politics by Professor George Lakoff, who delves further into this issue. Above all, I fear that we are afraid to affirm our values, because who are we to assert that our values are more important than anyone else's? I was told at one talk I gave about the Right Livelihood Awards I set up that the name was too judgmental. I was suggesting about that name that there are wrong livelihoods. I said, of course, if they weren't, we wouldn't be in the mess we are. As an antidote to this nonsense, I recommend Ken Wilber's novel Boomeritis. If our ancestors, of course, had lived like that, we'd still have slavery if they believed that all values are equal. Because who mandated Reverend Channing in the US and William Wilberforce in the UK to start campaigning against slavery, which was very politically correct at the time and very profitable? Nobody told them to. They simply started because they thought it was wrong. Their conscience mandated them. Their ultimate success and the success of campaigns for women's votes and civil rights succeeded because a self-selected group turned them against massive opposition from political and/or economic into moral and ethical issues. Today, climate chaos and global injustices, ever-growing income and wealth divides, and nuclear weapons are also such moral and ethical issues. Over 25 years ago, as David mentioned, I set up the Right Livelihood Awards, commonly known as the Alternative Nobel Prizes, simply because I felt challenged by Alfred Nobel's will, who said that he had created these awards to help those who were conferring the greatest benefit upon mankind. And so I wasn't interested in creating an anti-award, but I just thought, what is now the greatest benefit? What is most important? And that's why I told the Nobel Foundation that surely, having introduced an economics award, they should introduce a award for the environment. And when they said no, I decided to go ahead myself, and I was told the first year by the Swedish media that I was either a KGB or a CIA agent trying to discredit the Nobel Prizes. And in the second year, I was told that I was just some crazy guy, and in the fifth year, I was invited to present the awards in the Swedish Parliament, where we've been ever since. So it takes a few years. These awards have been called the world's premier awards for personal courage and social transformation. They are aimed to honor and highlight solutions. They are not for bright ideas. We need good theoreticians too, but these awards are for practice, for projects of hope. Many recipients are controversial, and the award, as I said, presented now in Parliament, can have a big impact, especially in countries in the global south. They have opened doors, including prison doors. They have stopped, in one case, a dictator from returning in triumph to his native country. Of course, we interfere in Asia, in Africa, and the value relativist would say, well, who are you? Surely this is a northern award. Yes, I'm Swedish, we give it out in the Swedish Parliament. So have you ever been accused of interfering, of not understanding African and Asian values? Yes, certainly. Letters came from the ambassadors of the dictators in Indonesia and Nigeria, complaining that our awards to human rights activists in those countries showed our lack of understanding for African and Asian values. But on a more serious level, talk of such values, conflicts and confusion are often not borne out. For example, we are told that in the West we put greater emphasis on individual, and the East puts greater emphasis on communal rights. And there is no doubt that is so. But governments who suppress individual rights are very unlikely to let communal rights flourish either. Another obstacle we face is that progressives don't like institution building. They prefer to believe that existing institutions can somehow be changed to do the job. But that is very naive. As Thomas Jefferson said, the most important task of every generation is to create the right institutions. Or to quote Hannah Arendt, the spirit of renewal needs its own institutions. In 1945, we did not re-establish the League of Nations, and our ruling ideologues know why that is so. They know why they spent so much energy in the 1990s setting up the World Trade Organization, although there already is a UN organization, UNCTAD, devoted to trade matters. But they wanted one they could control and which would serve their interests. Today, we're embarking on the most difficult journey humanity has ever undertaken, to protect and restore the health of our planet, which implies an end to major wars, for a nuclear-armed world can no longer afford these, and to global injustice, for you cannot protect our air, water and soil in an unjust world. If we fail, the results will be more far-reaching than ever before, both in time and space. But we have the knowledge, we have the resources, and the ability to do it. So what does it require? It requires politics based on ethics and science. That in return requires trusted leadership, ensuring that the interests of future generations are heard. It requires, in my opinion, an ongoing forum dedicated to implementing best policies, not another short-term event, passing resolutions for others to deal with. It requires an institution of moral power, looking at the whole, seeing the forest and not just the trees. His Holiness the Dalai Lama and others have long called for such a body, a global conscience whose influence would grow through the quality of its work and membership. Our ancestors, although much less able to influence the future than we are today, often had such councils of seers into the future, as they were called in India, which even had a veto power over daily political decisions taken. As we know, in this country, there was the more informal principle of the seventh generation, that every decision had to be looked at its impact on the seventh generation from now. This, of course, enabled our ancestors to consider danger hierarchies. You know, today we're often sort of presented with a small danger, and that's used to hide the much bigger threat. Thus, we are told that we must be sustainable economically. Now, of course, nobody wants a financial collapse, but if you look back historically, there have been state bankruptcies on several levels. They've always been overcome in at most one generation, often much sooner. But an environmental collapse will last for thousands of generations. And you know, with debtors, even with enemies, you can negotiate. But you can't negotiate with melting glaciers. We also argued that you need such councils on the local and regional level. You need to create future councils, for example, in the city, but not as some voluntary organization which can be ignored or dismissed, but as a constitutional body, somewhat similar to what our ancestors had. Not with a veto power, but with a mandate to prepare the city, the state, this country for the future, which would give them a lot of influence. It was very difficult for the legislature and the executive to ignore such a body which had that constitutional mandate. And even how the members are selected is not so terribly important. You could imagine them being elected. That would probably be seen as a threat by the legislature, so they could be appointed. But the mandate would make sure that they would, come onto this body as, in specific case, they as parents, as grandparents, not as businessmen, not as politicians. So you could, even such an appointed body would actually be a very strong addition to our present system of government, because it would institutionalize the voice of future generations, which at the moment is ignored in a very undemocratic fashion. As you know, one of the slogans of the US Revolution was no taxation without representation. But I mean, today we are taxing the very lives out of future generations without giving them any say in the matter. So, of course, we are now living in a very globalized society, and so I suggested some years ago that we need such a body on the global level, the World Future Council. It was an idea which after a few years was picked up by a businessman in Hamburg in Germany who went to convince the mayor, and so the city of Hamburg and this businessman have now provided the core funding for the first 3 years. Now there were several other cities interested, but Hamburg was the one which first came up with the funding, so that's where the secretariat now is. We also have a research office in London, and we'd like to set up offices in other countries, including in the US, as soon as the funding allows it also to get some campaigns going to work on policymakers worldwide. This is a normative body which will act as a global conscience, but it also is very much a body which will work with parliamentarians to ensure that the policies we now need are being implemented. And I'm very happy that David Krieger has agreed to be a member of the World Future Council. And also from the US, there is Francis Mola-P, who many of you may know, who wrote the book The Diet for a Small Planet, who founded Food First. As I said, it has a normative function, which is very important. I was told in countries in the global south where there is now a lot of values confusion because of the onslaught of global consumerism, which is eating up any progress there is, because even the father who's earned a bit more money still is poor, tells me he's poorer and more indebted than before, because he said before I could buy shoes from the local shoemaker for my children. Now they come home and crying because they've been mobbed in school because they're not wearing a pair of Nike. So this is a kind of pressure where you need to build up, counter pressure against commercial speech, as it's called. So our work with policymakers has already begun. We work with the e-Parliament, a budding initiative started by a Harvard professor, William Ury, of linking electronically all the world's members of parliament, all the ones who are democratically elected, and we have had joint hearings with them on climate change already in Nairobi. So why do we need such a new institution? Well, simply because existing global institutions are failing in their most basic duty to offer leadership required to sustain life on Earth. Therefore, we need to build this council, which is dedicated to that task, to bring together ethical leaders in an outcome-oriented body based on shared human citizen values, because we are certainly global consumers. We always consume, but it's never been our primary focus in life. We are world citizens above being global consumers. This World Future Council will link moral authority with political power by working closely, as I said, with parliamentarians, with governments, and with the UN, to introduce and implement national legislation and binding agreements based on best practice solutions, which we're already researching worldwide. It could serve as a global truth and reconciliation commission and expand the boundaries of what is regarded as realistic, feasible, and thinkable. It will build on the many valuable international initiatives which have been too narrowly focused or lacked necessary follow-up to succeed. The World Future Council initiative has had very broad international support, as shown by the variety and the enthusiasm of the endorsements, which you will find on www.worldfuturecouncil.org. And the offers of cooperation which we have received, also very positive response from the media so far. I want to close by emphasizing that we don't need a new ethics, which is, as is sometimes claimed. Where would it suddenly come from? We need to give a stronger voice to our existing values as citizens, and realize that while we've always traded and consumed, never before was competition for the cheapest the overriding global ideology. We need to supplement it by cooperation for the best, I suggest. Every time in the previous generations, the desire to build a better world for their children was the overriding aim. Because, as I said before, if they had lived like we are living, we would not be here, but long extinct. I don't think we've lost this basic human breeding instinct, but it is difficult, as the founder of transpersonal psychology, Abraham Maslow, once said, it's difficult to practice values like generosity, love, and solidarity in a society where the rules, institutions, and information streams are all geared to supporting lesser human qualities. So we need to change these rules, institutions, and information streams. And the World Future Council is a key part of this global power shift. It will aim to provide a trusted voice speaking up for the interests of children and future generations, an ongoing forum developing policy responses to the key challenges facing us, and the moral authority to overcome current reform implementation gaps. The Council will consist of 50 respected and trusted individuals from all over the world, wise elders, global pioneers, and young visionaries who have been chosen after an ongoing global consultation process. It will hold public hearings and work not just with parliamentarians, but of course with civil society organizations, governments, international organizations, to implement what is necessary and not just what is currently deemed realistic. Will it save the world? Of course not. But without such a voice, it is difficult to see how we will be able to turn around in time. That is why we get the support in Hamburg. Hamburg has a conservative mayor. That is why the chief advisor to the crown prince of one of the most conservative Arab oil sheikdoms in the Gulf came to me, and they want to host an event. And I said, but have you read what we have written? Isn't this too radical for you? And he said, no, it's about solutions, and we too need solutions. We have on the council from China, the Dean of Environmental Sciences from the University of Beijing. Yusun Dur, probably the most globally known African musician, has agreed to join. Anita Roddick, the founder of The Body Shop, is a member. And as I said before, we are now working on the first campaigns on climate change and oceans, which still need to be funded, to identify best policies and build up international agreements. Because the key symptom of the current crisis, I think, is this widespread collapse of trust in democratic politics. If all parties offer basically the same policies and choices, and the only choice we have, real choice we have, is restricted to the marketplace, then public debate and elections become meaningless. So I very much also see the World Future Council, although it will not claim to represent others, it is not a democratically elected body, to help revive the arena of democratic politics. Because clearly climate change is not just a market failure, it's a political failure, it's a media failure. As late as 2005, even the BBC felt obliged, whenever they had a debate about climate change, to have a so-called climate skeptic on the panel. And it's a civil society failure too. Let's be quite clear about it, that we have allowed it to come as far as this. The historian of civilizations, Arnold Toynbee, noted that the overwhelming majority of past civilizations collapsed from within when the elites lost the trust of the people. Moral restraint was lost, fundamentalist fanatics took over, and long periods of obscurantism, intolerance, and conflict followed. We're facing a similar threat today, but for the first time, it's global. But there is no reason why we should succumb to it except for our own fears and failures of will and imagination. We know what needs to be done to create a world worthy of our highest aspirations. It's time to think and act outside the box. To quote the US anti-slavery pioneer, Reverend William Ellery Channing, there are times in history when to dare is the highest wisdom. Thank you very much. Do you want to take the three at a time, maybe? Two or three at a time? I think it's probably
Okay. So we have microphones down in front. If you'd like to ask questions, we'll take a few questions. Yes.
I don't know if this is on, but...
Oh, I think so.
Okay. You said that markets should be our servants, not our masters, which is very wise. But there is a big failure of the market, which in the US, I mean, one big example is the hundreds of billions of dollars that we use to subsidize people to drive private automobiles. And this is equivalent to like $5 to $10 per gallon that we pay people to drive. And this is totally unknown to most Americans. And this would be just radical to change. And you're calling wisely that we have to make those kinds of changes. Could you say something more about what's needed to transform these markets to be our servants and not our masters?
Could you summarize what you're saying?
Jakob will do that. We'll take one more question, and then Jakob will respond. Go ahead.
Go ahead and ask the question. I'll wait.
No, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, are you familiar with the concept of natural capitalism as a way of generating solutions within the current economic framework? By this, I'll give you an example. If we had a carbon tax that actually made the cost of fossil fuel accurate within the capitalist system, it would mean that it would be very expensive to drive your own personal automobile or to buy chemically fertilized food from a long way away, but it would be natural for you to choose locally grown organic produce instead. Are you familiar with that concept, and what do you think of it?
Go ahead.
Well, both questions really dealt with what do you subsidize, what kind of reforms do you need for the market to work. You need to work, I think, on all levels. I mean, clearly some things are so bad they just need to be banned. I mean, you don't sort of allow people to choose between things which would literally kill off our children and enable and drown people. So there are some suggestions in order to encourage also technological progress, that every year the 25% or 20% worst performing models of cars, refrigerators, or whatever are withdrawn from the market, or actually banned. So that, I think, is one aspect. And then, of course, you need the carrot, and I think it's quite right to subsidize the right things. You subsidize the future. I mean, we subsidize the education of our children, we subsidize health. There is nothing wrong in principle with allocating subsidies if they are doing good. But as you rightly said, we are subsidizing completely the wrong things. And that is why it's so absurd when you hear people talking about letting the market operate, because that is not what these large planned economies, which these corporations are. I mean, they want the current level of state support. We haven't actually had deregulation. If you actually look at, what has happened over the past 10, 20 years, and Joseph Stiglitz again is very good about that. The NAFTA, for example, is not a free trade agreement. If it was a free trade agreement, it would be 2 or 3 pages. You just need some agreements for the transition to free trade. But it's the fact that it's very, very thick document. Same with the World Trade Organization shows these are actually agreements to protect special interests in very, very great detail. So clearly we need to recapture the state for for democratic politics. We can't allow that we have this democracy which really decides less and less, because behind the scenes there are cost-benefit analysis which are weighted in favor of the big players. Where people are not asked how much compensation they would accept for an environmental damage, because when they were asked that question, they demanded too much money and none of these big projects could happen. And the economists, of course, are out there to serve the people who want these projects to happen. So they changed it around and they said, how much would you pay to prevent this environmental damage? But that's not enough either, because then if a Bangladeshi says, well, I would pay $1 million to prevent the water rising so much that I get drowned, they'd say, but you don't have $1 million, so we're going to reduce, what you said to whatever you could afford. And this kind of cost-benefit analysis is what is behind when people tell you it's cheaper to adapt to climate chaos than to stop it. That is because they are basing that on calculations which value the life of poor people at 1/15th of the life of people in rich countries. Otherwise, it would be economically make sense to stop it. So that is what we are facing. Yes, I know natural capitalism, and I heard, Ray Anderson speak about what important it had for him when he turned around his company Interface, and of course there are a number of companies like that which which operate very, very positively. There is also a need for tax reform, for ecological tax reform. There's no doubt about it. Amory Lovins, one of our recipients, co-wrote a book on what they call Factor 4 and Factor 10. And I know Professor von Weizsäcker at the Wuppertal Institute has been very involved in publishing such books. Basically the principle that you can have the same amount of quality of life, but with a fraction of energy use through efficiency. And I said to one of the co-authors of this book, I said, why isn't it happening? And, entrepreneurs are not all stupid, He said, oh, well, of course it needs an ecological tax reform. You need to change discounting regulations. These kind of legal support is needed for the market to work in our service, and not at the moment to seem to be working against us, and especially against our children and their children.
Go ahead.
I wanted to ask one more question. It seems that in this country, at least, that the virtue of competition is held, well, it's called a virtue, considered a virtue, but perhaps misunderstood. I was wondering, in your consideration of the types of institutions that we need, whether you'd like to comment on any changes in both the vision that we have of competition and how your experience in Europe and the political system might give us some ideas in this country, since we seem to have just a two-party system, the possibility of only voting for one person or one project at a time.
Take another one? Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah?
All right, go ahead.
Newsweek did a poll, I think in the last year, that showed that 44% of Americans believe in biblical Armageddon in our lifetime. I'm not sure that people in the rest of the world realize this. How do you deal with a population where almost half the people believe that there is no future to plan for?
Yes, there's a book by Jeremy Rifkin on the the European, comparing the sort of European and American models, and we say so the European one is based on cooperation for the best, and the American one, competition for the cheapest. And I think, of course, we need competition. I'm all in favor of people competing about, producing the best and cheapest solar wafers, whatever. But you don't need the kind of competition which has only got the goal to, get a low figure in the bottom line and trying to hide as much as possible of what should go in the top line, because clearly, there's a book by Ralph Estes called The Tyranny of the Bottom Line, where he says that if you actually look at everything all the costs which US corporations have been able to externalize, then these costs are about 5 times as much as their profits in the years when he worked this out. So that's the kind of competition which is allowed by the government. I mean, it's quite clear that this is the task of society, of the government, is to set rules which don't allow us to externalize cost at the expense of nature, at the expense of society, at the expense of the future. And then when you have, people actually have to pay the real costs, then you get real competition. And that, I think, is what we need to build. And of course, the second question, yes, I mean, you are right. There is certainly I'm ever more aware of this discrepancy between the worldview of many people here, and of course, that's true. Some evangelicals who are also, concerned about the future of the environment and the destruction being done to God's creations. I mean, I don't see it as completely negative. In Europe, we actually have more support in some sense from conservatives, because the left are still so afraid of being seen to be statist and be tarred by the brush of going back to the 70s and whatever, that they seem to be more timid than some of the conservatives. Not all of them. I mean, there's a clear split in many of the conservative movements, and I think that's also beginning now to appear here in the evangelical movement. And I know the scientist E.O. Wilson has been writing a book that has been trying to ally himself with some of the evangelicals who understand that this is it's crazy to basically sit down and say, well, it doesn't matter what's going to happen to the planet, because God is going to come and recreate it, or we're all going to leave it and go into heaven in a few years' time. But certainly it is quite true that when I am at international meetings, I find quite often that it's easier for Europeans to communicate with Africans and Asians and Latin Americans, and now with people from the US, because not just because of not because the right wing is represented there so heavily, but because this of course also affects the progressives. There's a sort of certain timidity. When I was describing to a well-known US progressive a few weeks ago this idea for creating these local future councils, he didn't think this was a good idea here at all, because his immediate reaction is they're going to be captured by the neocons and are going to sort of steer us in the direction we don't want. But of course, you need to stand up and face this challenge and realize that this is not a monolith, which we are facing. And I think there are a lot of ability, we have a lot of abilities to do that by, focusing on, whether Armageddon comes or not. You still have the duty to preserve God's creation if you call yourself a Christian. I mean, that is just, one of many arguments. But there is no doubt that there is a huge difference in the perception of the world at the moment between the majority of North Americans and the majority of people in most other countries in the world.
Thank you all for being here. I want to make one comment about the university, and that is that I think the students are to be congratulated, finally standing up, going out and taking a stand against the war, the illegal war of aggression in Iraq. And I hope that for those of you who are students and participated in this, that your taste of protest will lead you to stand up until this war is over, to assure that there isn't another war initiated illegally against Iran. And finally, after more than 60 years, I hope you'll be active in assuring that the university's ties with the nuclear weapons laboratories will be severed once and for all. it's a challenge which should be in front of every member of this university community at all times. So this is the 6th Kelly lecture that was given tonight. If you're interested in earlier ones, which have also been remarkable, you can find them at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation website, which is wagingpeace.org. Please join me once again in thanking our speaker tonight, Jakob von Uexkull, for a wonderful lecture.